Okay, if not, then okay. So basically, in the course of Sanger sequencing, what we have discussed is basically that you have a template and then you have to use a primer, right? And you have to conduct four different reactions, and for each of the reactions, you should be using um, a mixture of DNTPs, four different DNTPs: DATP, DGTP, DCTP, and TTP. And along with that, you have to use a trace amount of DATP. Okay. Okay. So you use four different DNTPs along with one particular dideoxy nucleotide, right? So that whenever there is a incorporation of that DDNTP, it will terminate the chain. For example, if you are using DDATP in one particular reaction, whenever there is a T, for example, this one, there will be a chance that it will incorporate DDATP at this position and it will generate a fragment of length 8 or length, it may generate a fragment of length 12 nucleotide, it may generate a fragment of length 16, 20, 24, like that, right? Now if you are using DD TTP, so in that case you will be generating fragments like 9 nucleotide and so on. If you are using DDGTP, so whenever there is a C, there is a chance that it will get terminated with DDGTP, right? And it will generate corresponding fragments. And in that case, you will be getting fragments in your gel, and by looking at the size of the fragments, you can ascertain the the particular position of the complementary nucleotide in the template, right? So here we have performed four different reactions, with one with DDATP, DDCTP, DDGTP, and DDTTP, right? And for whenever there is a band corresponds to A, we can say that there should be a T in the parental template, right? If there is a band in the C, there should be a corresponding G in the template, right? For example, there is a 4 at the 5 position and 9 position, there is a band with DDCTP set. That means there should be a G at 9 and 4th position in the original template. So just by looking into the pattern of the band, you should be able to get the sequence of the complementary nucleotides. Okay, complementary template. And if you get a reverse complement, that should be the sequence of your template. Now this is how people used to do the Sanger sequencing. So this particular methodology has been developed by Sanger, and after his name, this methodology of unraveling the sequence of nucleic acid is named as Sanger sequencing. Okay, where you use DDNTPs as a chain terminator. Okay, so the principle is known as Sanger sequencing. Okay, so in earlier days, people used to run a set four different reactions with four different DDNTPs, and subsequently we used to run a big gel and utilizing a that. So from the pattern of the bands from that gel, you can actually manually ascertain the position of individual nucleotides. But as you can imagine, that this is extremely laborious and cumbersome practice, right? So for example, here it's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 nucleotide sequence that you are trying to get. And in that case, you'll be getting so many bands. So in that case, but if you say, for example, want to unravel the sequence of 100 nucleotide DNA or maybe 1,000 nucleotide DNA, in that case you should be getting 1,000 bands, right? In that case, for each of the sets, you might be getting each of the lengths, you might be getting about like 200, 300 bands, and that becomes extremely laborious to do manually, right? To manually ascertain the sequence of nucleic acids. So that's why people have worked on this in order to modify the overall process, keeping the basic principle the same. That is, still you should be using the chain termination using DDNTPs, but whether you can do it in a way that everything will be automated. Okay, so for example, so in the usual process, what you do is basically to each each of the reaction along with the 4 regular NTPs, you set up uh, for regular conventional Sanger sequencing, as you have seen here, that you have to set 4 different reactions where all of the reactions should be having DNTPs and one DDNTP. Okay, and then DNTPs to be added approximately 100-fold lower concentration than the corresponding DNTP, and then a series of differentially elongated DNA fragments will be produced. And how to visualize these fragments? In order to visualize these fragments, what needs to be done is, like, for each of the reaction you should be using a primer. Now if you label the primer, the 5' end of the primer, with phosphate, radioactive phosphate, in that case all of the fragments should be radioactively labeled, right? And whenever you will be running on that gel, and if you dry the gel and expose it on extra film, all of the products, because they will be radioactive, it will be giving a pattern on the X-ray film. And once you develop the X-ray film, you should be able to understand the pattern of the bands. You should be able to get an image of the bands, all of the bands.
Sir, can you repeat how we label the nucleotides radioactively?
Yeah, so basically, as we have discussed, that for all of the DNA sequences, you should be having the 5' phosphate and 3' OH, right? So if you can, so the 5' phosphate, you can introduce radioactively labeled phosphate in the 5' end. Okay, so 5' phosphate could be removed via one particular enzyme, and subsequently you can introduce radioactive phosphate at the 5' end. Okay, so that your primer becomes radioactively labeled. So for example, the 5' end phosphate can be 32P labeled. Okay, so that that particular phosphate will be labeled radioactive. Okay, so
So sir,
whenever
in all these strands, only the primer will be radioactively labeled, right?
yeah, because but then for all of the strand, the initiation is happening from the primer itself, because this 3' OH is acting as a initial initial OH, which will perform the nucleophilic attack. If you remember the DNA replication process, you always need a free 3' OH, right? Let me go back to, yeah, here. So you see, if this is a primer, okay, if this is a primer, you have a 3' OH. And if you label this particular phosphate with radioactive phosphate, radioactive phosphorus, in that case, if you use this particular primer for chain elongation, all of the primers, because they're radioactive, will generate radioactive fragments. So whatever fragments will be generated will be radioactive. Okay, is it clear?
Okay, sir, got it.
Yeah. So in that case, all of your bands will be radioactive. So in this particular gel, all of the bands are radioactive. And you expose it, you first dry the gel and then you expose it on the X-ray film, and you will get the exposure for the radioactive band. So you will get a complete image of your gel on a X-ray film. So that's how people used to actually get the image of these big sequencing gels. And then you have to manually assign nucleotides for corresponding to each of these bands. Okay, but then because, as I have mentioned, it used to be really laborious. So that's why people come up with automated sequencing. And in this particular case, what is done is basically you add, you do not set four different reactions. You just set only one reaction. So say, for example, this is your template, this is your primer. And in this particular case, the primer is not labeled. Primer is non-radioactive. But then you are adding all four DNTPs and four DDNTPs in much lesser amount, but all those four DDNTPs are labeled with fluorophores. Okay, now A's are labeled with different fluorophore, so that, say for example, that is green fluorophore that could be detected in green channel. T's are detected with a fluorophore that could be detected using a red channel. C's are labeled with a fluorophore which could be detected in a blue channel, and then G's are labeled with a fluorophore which could be detected on a yellow channel. And you set up the reaction. So whenever there is a chain termination with A, that particular fragment will be labeled with green fluorophore. If there is a chain termination with T, that will be labeled with a red fluorophore, right? In that case, whenever there is a chain termination with one particular nucleotide, that particular fragment will be labeled with one particular color, right? And then subsequently what you do is you do not run conventional gel, rather you pass them on a capillary gel. Okay, so this is a capillary gel electrophoresis which is going on, through which all of these fragments are passing. And through this chromatography you can separate different DNA fragments on uh, different DNA fragments which are even a single nucleotide different in terms of their size. Okay, so that, and now whenever they are passing through the detector, the laser detector, it will detect the corresponding color and will produce a corresponding peak in the chromatogram. And if it is a red peak, you will know that that fragment of corresponding size is labeled with T, right? If there is a yellow peak, you will say that that fragment of that particular length is labeled with G. Okay, so that chromatogram actually will have different peaks corresponding to different fluorophores with which they are labeled with, and will have different sizes. So the x-axis will determine the size and the y-axis will give you the which particular fluorophore with which it has been labeled with. Okay, and that complete data could be automatically converted the into the digital database, which will then give you the sequence of the actually complementary base pair or complementary template, so that you can directly get the sequence of the complementary bases or the template which you want to know. Okay, so in that way, instead of setting four different reactions and then running them on gel, exposing them on X-ray films, and you have to work with radioactivity, here everything you are doing on an automated basis. All you need to do is to set up the reaction and then you put them in the sequencer. The sequencer will automatically suck in the reaction, will pass it through the capillary gel electrophoresis, and there will be a laser detector which will be detecting the corresponding fluorophores. Okay, that data will be converted into this digital platform in order to automatically give you the sequence of the nucleotide. Okay, so still we use Sanger sequencing till that, but now we use automated sequencer. So the basic principle remains the same. There is the chain termination using DDNTPs, but you use a machine which can do the entire processing for you to give you the final result. Okay, so the automated sequencing, everything is mentioned here, and now we are going to get into the next lecture. Okay, so far, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the next lecture.
Sir?
Yes.
Sir, in the first method of DNA replication, which you taught in the last class,
Mm-hmm.
uh, why did the replication start before the parent DNA get completely unwinded? I mean, why should it occur before?
So you are talking about the natural DNA replication,
Yeah,
not the
yeah. First,
right?
not the laboratory one.
Yeah, the natural DNA replication. So see, think about the size of our genome. Okay, in case of the bacteria, the smallest possible size. So I have a slide here. So in case of the bacteria, the genome size or the size of the chromosome is 4.6 million bases. Okay. Now, if you want to separate, so when you are doing PCR, you are taking small fragments of the DNA and then you're separating them up from each other so that you can, using the heat, so that you can, so that the polymerase can read the template. But when it is happening inside the cell, the cellular machinery is handling such a big size of the of the DNA, right? 4.6 million, even in the case of the smallest possible organism, the E. coli. Okay, in case of the human, it's 3.2 billion, right? So that's why it's not possible to completely unwind the two DNA strands from each other and then only start the replication process. The replication happens, and again, that single-stranded DNA will be extremely unstable. So even before it can be utilized as a template, during the unwinding of the complete DNA template, it will get degraded. So that's why it's not wise to completely separate the two DNA strands from each other. Rather, you separate the small portions of the DNA and keep on replicating that, so that the bubble, if you consider it as a bubble, it will keep on moving, or the replication fork will keep on moving, and the replication DNA replication will following that. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so in today's lecture, in today's class, we are going to initiate a new lecture, which is going to which where we are going to talk about the transcription. So in the previous class, previous two classes, we have discussed about the DNA replication process and the artificial or the laboratory-based DNA replication process, which is known as polymerase chain reaction. Okay, then we have discussed about the Sanger sequencing, and if you look into the particular channel of the nucleic acids, you should be able to find several videos describing DNA replication process, describing the PCR polymerase chain reaction, then a video for Sanger sequencing, and also a video by which you will see that how you can use the polymerase chain reaction in order to detect the viral RNA, like the coronavirus RNA. Okay, so all those videos are there, so feel free to go through the videos to make yourself more comfortable about the preliminary concepts of DNA replication. Okay, now in this particular class, when we are going to discuss about the transcription. So getting back to the central dogma of life, that is the the transport of genetic information from DNA to RNA and then RNA to protein. Okay, so DNA gets replicated, and we have talked about it, that how DNA polymerase performs the DNA replication event. The next step is transfer of the information, the genetic information from DNA to RNA, so that it can further be transported into proteins. And this particular step of RNA synthesis from DNA is known as transcription, which is performed by the polymerase or RNA polymerase, or I should say DNA dependent RNA polymerase, because it utilizes the DNA as a template in order to synthesize the RNA. So it depends upon the DNA in order to synthesize the RNA. So that's why DNA dependent RNA polymerase. Okay. And again, why it's transcription and why it's replication? So why synthesis of RNA from DNA is transcription and synthesis of protein from RNA is translation? Because if you look into the DNA and the RNA, the basic constituents are the same, which is basically the nucleic acids. In case of the DNA, it's a double-stranded nucleic acid. In case of the RNA, it's a single-stranded nucleic acid. But the basic constituents are the same. Here it's ATGC, here it's AUGC. So it's like of the information is getting transported from one particular piece of paper into the other piece of paper using the same language. That's why it's called transcription. It's like getting your transcripts, like the results, the grades, into one particular form, which is known as transcript, right? Similarly, here also the information is getting transferred in within the same using the same script. So that's why transcription. But when you think about the protein, they are composed of 20 different amino acids. So monomeric units of the proteins are basically amino acids. And there could be 20 different naturally occurring amino acids which constitutes the protein. Okay, so that's why transfer of information from RNA to protein is like a transfer of information from one particular language to a completely different language. In case of the RNA, it's a language, the script is written with the 4 different nucleotides, AUGC. In case of the DNA, same. It's written with the 4 different letters, 4 different nucleotides, ATGC. But in case of the protein, there are 20 different letters in the script to embed all the informations. So that's why it's a completely different language. So the information is getting translated into a completely different language. That's why translation. Okay. So in today's class, we are going to talk about transcription. Okay. So in 1990, there was a huge project conceived by National Institute of Health, USA, NIH. Okay, and the project was to unravel the sequence of nucleic acids present in the human genome. That's why that particular project was known as Human Genome Project. Okay, everyone please mute themselves, please. Okay, so the project was named after the Human Genome Project because we wanted to know the information embedded within the human genome. Okay, and it was made possible just after the Sanger sequencing has been developed. Sanger sequencing has been developed back in 1980s. But then it used to be really laborious. But then during the 1990s, the automated sequencing came up. Okay, automated sequencing concept came up, and that's was the right time. So that's why that was the right time in order to initiate this particular project. That whether we could know the sequence of the entire human genome. So in human we have different chromosomes, right? 46 chromosomes, 23 base pairs of chromosomes, 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 chromosomes in total, right? And the total size is about 3.2 billion nucleotides. Whether we could know the sequence of all of these nucleotides, because if we could know that, we would understand what are the information which is embedded in the human genes, right? All of the human contains a large number of genes, about like 21,000 genes. Okay, so and each of the genes are unique, different from each other. So say for example, there is a lot of problems, lot of genetic disease that occurs, which occurs due to the problem in the DNA replication, which results in the introduction of the mutation in our genes. Okay, so if we can compare, so say for example, there is a cancer patient. If we can isolate his gene, isolate his a little bit of sample from him, and then can sequence the whole genome. In that case, we should be able to know that what are the mutations which has been introduced, which has resulted in that particular disease, the cancer, right? But in order to understand that, first we have to understand that what is the regular course of the sequences, what is the actual sequence of the human genome. Then only we will be able to understand or we will be able to characterize the changes or the mutations in the human genome. And subsequently, we should be able to treat them, right? So that's why it was extremely, utterly important to understand the whole lot of information which was embedded in the human genome. So it's about 6 different nations multiple 100 different universities, around like 100 different universities took part into this particular project. And by 2003, that means about 13 years it took in order to unravel all the information which is embedded in the human genome. Okay. And nowadays, so it was 2003 and today is 2021, right? So only 17 years from that first set of sequences. Now we know so much about the entire human genome that nowadays there are companies actually. Okay, there are companies which can take your sample and they can derive the entire sequence of your genome. It's so regular, so easy nowadays. So there are large number of different companies which can actually take up your sample in order to give you the sequence of your entire genome. And they will not only give you the sequence of your entire genome, they will give you consultation that what are the possible chances that you get some genetic diseases. Okay, what should be the lifestyle that you should be maintaining. Okay, so with the help of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all those things, just by looking into your sequence, you should be able to, doctors and biologists should be able to predict that what are the different kinds of disease that you might be having in future, and what are the kind of lifestyle that you should be maintaining in order to avoid these kind of diseases. Okay, it's so regular nowadays. In fact, one of our alumni, Professor Dr. Anuradha Acharya, Anu Acharya, you can just Google her name, and she is, I think, a chemical engineer or a physicist, either a chemical engineer or a physicist who graduated from IIT Kharagpur, and she is the CEO of one particular company known as Map My Genome, because their company actually takes up sample and do the sequencing and then do the consultation. Okay, they call it Janam Patri, not Janam Patri actually, Genome Patri. Genome Patri is the regular thing. They call it Genome Patri. Why? Because based upon your genome, they can predict your future to some extent, or they can actually predict your um, give you some futuristic ideas about your health. Okay, so not about your wealth though, it's all about health. Okay, but anyway, so there was the Human Genome Project. Now we are talking about, sometimes we are talking about genome, sometimes we are talking about genes. So what is the difference between genome and the gene? Anybody knows it about it? What is the difference between genome and gene?
So I think genes are a particular sequence of DNA which contain the genetic information.
Okay. What about the genome? So the complete set of DNA or the genetic material which one particular organism has is their genome. Human genome is composed of 3.2 billion base pairs, total 46 chromosomes. Okay, so the complete set of genetic information is known as genome. Okay, when it comes to gene, it's basically particular regions within your genome which encodes for proteins. Okay, so it's not that entire part of your genome encodes for proteins. Specific regions of your genome encodes for the proteins. Okay, for example, you see, look into this particular chart. So here you can see that E. coli, the genome size is 4.6 million, right? And the total number of protein coding genes, total number of proteins which gets encoded from this 4.6 billion is 4,250. Okay. In case of the yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, it's 12 million. The total number of proteins is 5.6. In case of human, it's 3.2 billions, and total number of proteins that gets encoded is 19,000. So can you see one particular trend in from this table, that the higher is the organism, the more complicated is the organism, the ratio of protein by, or the ratio of protein coding genes by total number of genome, the total size of the genome gets decreased, right? In case of the E. coli, it's 4,000 proteins which gets encoded by 4.6 million base pairs. Whereas in case of the human, they encode only 19,000 genes out of 3.2 billion base pairs. Okay, that means, first of all, not the entire part of your genome encodes for the protein. There are specific portions of your genome which is designated as genes which encodes for the proteins, first of all. And second, the more complicated the organism would be, is the higher or the larger segments of their genome will not be used for encoding the proteins. Okay, so is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Sir, is there any particular reason for this? I mean, the increasing number of genome size, the lesser the ratio.
Yes, yes. So there is definitely a particular reason for that. If you think about the E. coli, that's why I wanted to check that whether this particular concept is clear, that the higher is the complication of the organism, more complicated or more developed the organism is, the higher segments of the genome will remain unused for encoding proteins. But those parts of the genomes are not actually junk. Previously, people used to say that these are junk materials. Okay, but those are not junk. Those are actually used for the regulatory purposes. Okay, for example, in the case of the E. coli, the life cycle is only 20 minutes. That means whatever proteins needs to be encoded, they will encode within that 20 minutes of time, and they will acquire glucose from the or the nutrients from the media, and then metabolize that nutrient to generate ATP. That ATP will be utilized to replicate the DNA. Subsequently, those DNAs will encode proteins and they will perform the cell division process. And that's it. And that will be completed within 20 minutes, right? But in case of the human, you think about it. So first of all, when we take birth, so there are certain proteins. So at that time, all the proteins, housekeeping proteins, gets expressed more and more, so that which are required for the development purpose. So up to a age, up to maybe teenage, those developmental proteins gets expressed more and more, so that it helps us to develop our physique, our mental development and all those things. But then again, those development related genes goes down. Okay, those proteins doesn't express anymore. They will be expressed, but only at a basal level, so that they can maintain your physique. But then again, after the teenage, a lot of hormonal changes will occur into each of these systems. That means you need to express different kind of gene at different steps of your life cycle. Okay, so that's why even if you are having only 19,000 genes expressed, but in order to regulate the expression of these 19,000 genes, or in order to regulate the production of these 19,000 proteins, you need large chunk of your genome which will actually control the production of the proteins. Okay, so that's why the more developed one particular organism is, the higher portion of its genome will be utilized for regulating the expression of the genes. Okay, and actually in this particular class we are going to discuss one simple regulatory mechanism, that how the expression of the gene gets regulated even in the case of the E. coli. It's not that in the case of the E. coli there is no regulation. In the case of the E. coli also, in case of the bacteria also, you can see regulation. And we are going to discuss one of those in this class only. Okay, so in the transcription process, okay, so that's what we were discussing, that the total DNA content versus transcribable content. Okay, it's not that the entire DNA gets transcribed. Only certain portion of your genome gets transcribed, and whatever gets transcribed, that will produce proteins. Okay, now again that not all the portions will get, so whatever portions get transcribed will produce proteins. Okay, so the protein coding sequence is only 1.5% of the total DNA content. Okay, out of these 3.2 billion, only 1.5% gets encoded into proteins. And for that purpose, you produce mRNAs. Okay, so there are three different kinds of RNAs which gets produced or which gets transcribed from your genome. First of all, mRNA, second, ribosomal RNA or rRNA, and third is the transfer RNA or tRNA. Okay, so the mRNAs, these messenger RNAs, contains the information which gets translated into proteins. Other than that, you have the ribosomal RNAs and the transfer RNAs which never get translated into proteins. Rather, they take part in the protein synthesis process. Okay, so the messenger RNA contains the information which gets translated into proteins. But then ribosomal RNAs and the transfer RNAs actually physically take part in the protein synthesis process. They never produce proteins, but they help producing the proteins. Okay. So the genetic information which is needed for the protein synthesis remains in the messenger RNA. So that's why it's called messenger RNA, or it contains the message which is needed for the protein synthesis. Okay, so and again, most of the DNA sequences remains untranscribed. They don't even produce RNAs. Okay. So how does the transcription takes place? How does transcription occurs inside the cell? So say for example, this is a portion of your DNA, a particular locus of your chromosome. Okay, and then this particular region contains the information which is going to get transcribed to produce RNA. So this is the gene. Okay, so we call this particular region a gene. And for each of the genes, you should have a very definite boundaries. There should be a start point and there should be a stop point. Okay, so whenever there is a gene, there should be very distinct boundaries for the genes. Okay, and just on the left hand side of the start of the gene, you should be able to find a sequence which acts as a promoter. Okay, so what is the promoter? Promoter is the sequence which gets recognized by the RNA polymerase. Okay, so RNA polymerase can recognize specific sequence elements upstream of the gene. Upstream means on the left hand side, downstream means on the right hand side. Okay, so the gene is going to get transcribed from left to right, from 5' to 3'. Okay, so that's why the promoter should be upstream of the gene. Okay, so and this particular sequence gets recognized by the polymerase first. Okay, and that is the initiation point for the gene. Okay, now once it recognizes the promoter, subsequently it should unwind the two DNA strands from each other. Okay, and then it will keep on reading the template DNA strand to synthesize the RNA. That is known as elongation. And finally, when it reaches the stop signal, it will be the polymerase will fall off of the template, releasing the nascent mRNA strand. Okay, so this is how the transcription takes place. Okay, now let's get into the detail of these steps, that is the initiation, elongation process and the termination process. How does it occur? So first of all, let's look into the promoter. Okay, that is the initiation part. So say for example, this is a double-stranded DNA. Now in the double-stranded DNA, one particular strand will act as a template, okay, for the synthesis of the RNA. So that once the double-stranded DNA gets unwinded, the polymerase will read the template strand to synthesize the RNA. So it will read each of these nucleotides and will incorporate the complementary nucleotide in the RNA template, in the nascent RNA strand. So if there is a T, it will incorporate U. If there is T, it will incorporate A. Okay, if there is A, it will incorporate U. If there is A, it will incorporate U. If there is a C, it will incorporate G, and so on. Okay, so in that case, if this is the template strand, you can see this will be the sequence of the RNA strand. So TAA, UAA, CGC, GCG, TAC, AUG, CG. Okay. So the RNA which will get synthesized will be perfectly complementary to the template strand. And hence, as you can see, this should have exactly the same sequence of this strand, right? With only difference is the T's will be replaced by the U. Okay, that means this particular strand will be named as template strand because it is acting as a template for the synthesis of the RNA, whereas the complementary strand will be named as coding strand. Why coding strand? Because it contains the information which is going to get encoded in the RNA. So this is the information which is going to be expressed in the form of the RNA. So that's why the RNA and the coding strand should have exactly the same sequence, except the fact that whenever there is a T in the DNA strand, it will be U in the RNA strand. Okay, so the entire information which is needed for the protein synthesis will get transferred from the coding strand to the RNA. Okay, so now in order to perform the transcription process, first of all, the polymerase needs to recognize the promoter sequence. Okay, so first of all, the promoter sequence. So this is +1, that means this is the transcription start site. Transcription start site is always designated as +1. The particular nucleotide from where the transcription begins is designated as +1. So whenever there is a gene at -10 sequence, at the -10 position, you should be able to find a sequence which actually gets recognized by the RNA promoter. Okay, so here you see this is the +1 and subsequently the upstream nucleotide will be 0, and at the -10 position you should be able to find a promoter sequence, and this promoter sequence will specifically be recognized by the RNA polymerase or DNA dependent RNA polymerase. And as soon as it recognizes that, subsequently it will unwind the two DNA strands from each other and then will initiate the reading of the template strand so that it can produce the RNA which will be having the same sequence as the coding strand, with the exceptions that whenever there is a T, there should be a U in the RNA. Okay, now if we look into the sequence of the prokaryotic promoter, this is how it looks like: TA, TAT. If we look into the sequence of the eukaryotic promoter, this is how it looks like: TA, TAA. So do you see any similarity or the particular feature which is present in the promoter sequences? Anybody wants to answer?
Sir, in both cases, it consists of T and A bases only.
Yes. And any idea that why? So if you find any promoter sequence, whether it's a prokaryotic, whether it's a eukaryotic, you will always find these kind of AT rich sequence in the promoter region. Any guess that why there are always AT rich sequences in the promoter region?
So maybe because it's easier to break the hydrogen bonds there, because there
Yes,
are only
exactly right. So TA sequences, the AT base pairs are or contains only 2 hydrogen bonds. That means it will be really easy to unwind the sequence. And in order to initiate the transcription process, the polymerase, the RNA polymerase needs to unwind the two DNA strands from each other. That's why the particular promoter sequence that RNA polymerase recognize always have higher percentage of T's and A's within it itself, so that it could be easily unwinded, so that the polymerase can initiate the transcription process. Okay, now the RNA polymerase contains 5 different subunits. Okay, the alpha alpha, beta beta prime, and the sigma. So 5 different subunit. Now what happens is, first of all, the sigma subunit can recognize the promoter sequence specifically, whereas the alpha or beta beta prime subunits has no sequence specificity. So that's why first step, as the first step of the initiation, first the sigma subunit recognizes and then binds with the promoter, and subsequently it recruits the other subunit of the RNA polymerase, which is now ready to initiate the transcription process. Okay, so that's why the complete enzyme or the hollow enzyme is composed of alpha alpha, beta beta prime, as well as sigma. But then, because sigma subunit binds the promoter sequence in a very strong fashion, it is not possible, although it can initiate the transcription process, it will not be able to proceed along the template so that it will enter into the elongation phase. So the recognition of the promoter by the sigma subunit and then reconstitution of the hollow enzyme is the initiation. But once after it's initiated, the transcription is initiated, now the polymerase needs to move ahead so that it can keep on unwinding the double-stranded DNA and then keep on incorporating the nascent nucleotides in the RNA strand so that it can get into the elongation phase. That's not possible. Why? Because sigma subunit interacts with the promoter very strongly, and this interaction actually inhibits the polymerase to move forward along the template. Okay, so that's why what happens is, just after the initiation process, the sigma subunit gets kicked off of the actual polymerase, which then contains only the core enzyme, which is composed of alpha alpha, beta beta prime. That means the RNA polymerase doesn't need sigma. The core enzyme, which is composed of alpha alpha, beta beta prime, is good enough to perform the RNA synthesis process. It needs the sigma only to recognize the promoter so that it can initiate the transcription process at a particular point. Okay, so that is the initiation. And so how can you distinguish the initiation from the elongation phase? Once the sigma gets kicked out of the polymerase, then the polymerase can move forward across the template and hence can enter into the elongation phase. So this dissociation of the sigma from the hollow enzyme denotes the transition from the initiation to the elongation phase of transcription. Okay. Now, once it enters into the elongation phase, it can processively read the template so that it can keep on synthesizing the RNA. Okay, so the RNA polymerase is completely processive. A transcript is synthesized from the start to end by a single RNA polymerase. So once it initiates and it enters into the elongation phase, it can read the entire gene until it reaches the transcription termination signal or the transcription stop signal. Until that point, it will keep on reading the template and it will keep on elongating or synthesizing the nascent RNA strand. Once it reaches the stop signal, then only the core enzyme will be dissociated from the template and the RNA synthesis will be stopped. Okay. And again, one very important thing is, in the case of the DNA replication process, the DNA polymerase needs a primer. But in case of the RNA polymerase, it can initiate the synthesis de novo, and that's why it doesn't need a primer. So that's why in the case of the DNA replication process, there is a primase which is nothing but a RNA polymerase, and that's why it can synthesize a primer without having any 3' pre-existing 3' OH. Okay. Now, if you look into the percentage of different RNA molecules, the messenger RNA molecule, total RNA, out of the total RNA molecule, messenger RNA molecules are only 5%. And then tRNA molecules is 15%, rRNA molecules are 80%. Okay. So these tRNA and rRNA molecules physically participate in the protein synthesis process, whereas all the information which are needed for the translation into proteins, translation of RNA into proteins remains within the messenger RNA, and that contains only 5%. That constitutes only 5% of the total cellular RNA. But then transcription means synthesis of all of these RNAs, that is the messenger RNAs, tRNAs and rRNAs. And who transcribes this huge pool of rRNA and tRNA? So in case of the bacteria, it's only a single RNA polymerase which can transcribe all these 3 types of RNA polymerases. Whereas in case of the eukaryotes, there are different kinds of RNA polymerases for synthesis of mRNA, synthesis of rRNA, synthesis of tRNA. So different RNA polymerases synthesizes different kinds of RNAs. Okay, in the case of the eukaryotes. And one very interesting fact is, so we have talked about Professor Arthur Kornberg, okay, who has invented or elucidated the mechanism of DNA replication. So Professor Arthur Kornberg has purified, crystallized and characterized the DNA polymerase and its mode of action. Okay, and his son, Professor Roger Kornberg, he has actually characterized the RNA polymerase and subsequently characterized the mechanism of transcription. Okay, and he also got Nobel Prize in 2006. So Professor Arthur Kornberg has received a Nobel Prize for unraveling the mechanism of DNA replication, whereas Professor Roger Kornberg, his son, has received Nobel Prize for elucidating the mechanism of transcription. Okay, so 2 Nobel Prizes within the same family, and if you look into the research, they are also in the same mode. So DNA replication and then RNA, then the transcription, right? Now, how does the RNA synthesis takes place? It's the same as we have discussed about the DNA replication process. So, say for example, this is an existing growing RNA chain. So you have a phosphate, then you have a sugar and a base, right? And this is the incoming nucleotide, RNTP. Okay. So now this 3' OH can perform a nucleophilic attack on the alpha phosphate of the RNTP, of the incoming RNTP. That will lead to the release of a diphosphate moiety and resulting in a formation of a phosphodiester linkage. So in that way, the RNA will be synthesized. So here this is a enlarged image of the transcription which is happening. So you see, this is the RNA polymerase. This circle is representing the RNA polymerase. This is the coding strand. This is the template strand. Okay, and this is the RNA. The pink line is RNA under synthesis. So you see, the sequence of the RNA is exactly the same as the sequence of the coding strand. Only difference is whenever there is a T in the coding strand, there is a U in the RNA strand. So, and this particular unwinded sequence is known as transcription bubble, okay, which resides within the RNA polymerase during the transcription process only. So as the RNA polymerase moves forward during the course of the reaction, the transcription bubble will also move forward, and within the transcription bubble there will be unwinded double-stranded DNA, and the template strand will remain hybridized with the nascent DNA strand. Okay. Now, in case of the bacteria, the transcription leads to the production of mRNA, and that mRNA can be utilized by the translation machinery to synthesize the proteins. But in case of the eukaryotes, that mRNA needs to be processed before it can be utilized by the ribosomal machinery in order to synthesize the proteins. Okay. Why? Because if you look the spatiotemporal dynamics of the transcription and you compare between the bacteria and the eukaryotes, you see this is the DNA, okay, double-stranded DNA, and here is the transcription takes place. Okay, so this is the RNA polymerase which is synthesizing the RNA, and as soon as it is getting synthesized, even before the completion of the RNA synthesis, it is getting recognized by the ribosome, and that is synthesizing the protein. So even before the completion of the transcription process, the translation gets initiated. Okay, but in case of the eukaryotes, there are different compartments within the cell, right? So DNA replication and transcription happens within the nucleus. Subsequently, these mRNAs needs to be get exported into the cytoplasm, so that because ribosomes are there in the cytoplasm. So only after the mRNAs gets exported into the cytoplasm, then only the ribosome can initiate the protein synthesis. Okay, that means in case of the bacteria, there is no lag between the transcription and translation. It almost occurs simultaneously. But in case of the eukaryotes, there is a distinct time lag between transcription and translation process. That means the mRNAs needs to be stable enough before it can be utilized, because they have to live significant period of time before they can be utilized for the translation process. So stability is a major factor in case of the eukaryotic transcripts, okay, or the eukaryotic mRNAs. Okay, and that's why in order to assure the stability of the mRNAs, we have to, so the mRNAs needs to be processed before it can be utilized for protein synthesis. First of all, once it gets synthesized, once the mRNA gets synthesized, it gets capped. Okay, so there is an enzyme called capping enzyme which adds up a GTP in the opposite order. Okay, usually when when the nucleotides are getting added into the growing RNA chain, it always gets added from a 5' to 3' direction. Okay, so this is the 5', this is 3', and this is the, again the 3' is attacking the 5' end, and it is getting incorporated. So always the NTPs are getting incorporated from a 5' to 3' direction. Okay, but in case of the cap, what happens is GTP is added in the opposite orientation, so that it cannot be elongated in the opposite direction. So that makes a stop. Okay, and because it kind of caps the mRNA so that it cannot be degraded by the cellular enzymes. So the 5' capping gives additional stability to the mRNA so that they gets extra stability. Another processing is the addition of the poly A tail. So what happens is, as soon as the RNA polymerase reaches the transcription stop signal, there is a ribonuclease or the enzyme which can cleave the RNA, and subsequently there is a polymerase called poly A polymerase, which is a template independent polymerase. It doesn't need a template in order to perform the synthesis or the synthesis of the nucleic acid. And what it does is it keeps on adding multiple A's at the 3' end. Okay, so that there will be a synthesis of a poly A tail, and it can be as long as 100 to 200 nucleotide. So for each of the eukaryotic transcripts, you will always have a 5' cap and the 3' poly A tail. And these two modifications are extremely essential for number one, the stability of the mRNA, and number two, for the export of the mRNA from the nucleus to the cytoplasm. Because as I have mentioned in this particular slide, that once the mRNA gets produced, you see it has a cap, 5' cap, and the 3' poly A tail. Subsequently, this features can be recognized by specific machineries which can transport this mRNA across the nuclear membrane so that it could be transported to the cytoplasm where it gets translated. So the poly A and capping is extremely important for the eukaryotic mRNAs for two purposes. One, for utilizes for increased stability of the mRNA, and number two, for the transport of the mRNA from the nucleus to the cytoplasm. Also, when in the next class we are going to talk about the translation, we will see it's the 5' cap structure which gets recognized. In the case of the eukaryotic mRNAs, it is the 5' cap structure which gets recognized by the ribosomes. Until unless you have a cap structure, the ribosome will not be able to recognize those mRNAs, and hence it will not get translated. Okay, so that's why the capping actually makes the mRNAs more effective template for translation. Okay, that's why the tRNAs or the rRNAs, the transfer RNAs or the ribosomal RNAs never contains these modifications like the caps or the poly A tails, because these are needed for the translation process. So that's why the tRNAs or rRNAs never contains the cap structures. Okay.
Sir, can you like repeat how the poly A structure provides stability? Poly A tail.
So actually what happens is there are multiple different enzymes in the cytoplasm which is known as exonucleases. Okay. Now exonucleases can act on a nucleic acid either from a 5' to 3' or 3' to 5' direction. That means it can recognize the 3' end and can chew up the RNA from the 3' end, can keep on removing nucleotides one after another. Similarly, it can recognize the 5' end and can then keep on removing nucleotides from the 5' end. It's more kind of a chewing up from one particular end. Okay, but that's why if it can if it recognize if there is a 5' cap, because at the 5' portion in the cap structure there is a GTP which is in the opposite orientation. Okay, that's why the exonucleases cannot initiate their cleavage process if there is a 5' cap at the 5' end. Also at the 3' end, there is a poly A tail. So it can recognize the poly A tail and keep on removing the poly A tail. But as I have mentioned, there is about like the length of the poly A tail could be 200. Okay, so it's a really big poly A tail. So even if the exonuclease, which can chew up the RNA from 3' to 5' end, can recognize the poly A tail and remove significant portion of the poly A tail, that is not going to impact the overall structure of the mRNA, because the actual coding sense or the coding information resides within the mRNA, not in the poly A tail. Poly A tail is only for the stability of the mRNA. Okay, so this is how the cap as well as the poly A structure both can increase the stability of the mRNA. Okay.
Yes, sir. Got it.
Okay, so that was the two particular modifications which is exclusive for the eukaryotic transcripts. One is the 5' cap and the other is the 3' poly A tail. Those are extremely essential for a particular transcript to be utilized for the translation process. Okay, but then there is another post-transcriptional modification which needs to be done before the mRNA could be utilized for the protein synthesis or for the translation process, and that is known as splicing. So what is splicing? So if you look into the mRNAs, there are certain regions. For example, here there are certain regions denoted as red. Okay, so these regions doesn't contains the information which is needed for the protein synthesis. It's only the blue regions which contains the information which is needed for the protein synthesis. Okay, that's why before the mRNA could be utilized for the for the translation process, these regions, extra regions, needs to be removed. Okay, so the particular regions which contains the coding information, here the blue regions, is known as exons, whereas the red regions which doesn't contains the coding information is known as introns. So during the splicing process, the spliceosomal machinery can actually remove the introns from the mature mRNA. So once the mRNA gets synthesized, it is like this. It doesn't have a cap, it doesn't have a poly A tail, and also contains the introns. Subsequently, the cap, subsequently, it needs to be capped, as well as the poly A tail needs to be added. And then the introns needs to be removed, the spliced out, so that it can form the final mRNA, which is now ready for the transcription process. Now, you may have a question that why there are introns which has been included in the genome. Okay, so as I was saying that there are a large number of regions which never get translated into proteins. Introns are one of those. You will only find introns into the higher eukaryotes. You will not be able to find any introns in the prokaryotes. But why does we have introns? Okay, the answer is this, that inclusion of the introns within your gene includes more variation into your gene product. How? Say for example, this is your chromosomal DNA and you have these blue, green, orange, violet, red and dark blue regions which are different exons. So this is one particular gene and these are your exons, whereas the light blue regions are the introns which doesn't encode for the protein. It's only the exons which contains the information, the coding information for the proteins. Okay, so first of all, let's see the transcription. First of all, it gets transcribed. So primary transcript should contain all of these introns as well as exons, but subsequently they will undergo splicing, and they actually can undergo alternative splicing. For example, in one particular case of splicing, there will be exons 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and it will result in a formation of a protein like a protein 1. In another alternative splicing, you will be able to, it will synthesize a mRNA which will be having exons 1, 3, 5, 6, and it will produce protein 2. In another case, it will be synthesizing protein 3. Now, if I ask you can you predict what will be the relation between these three proteins, protein 1, 2, and 3? Any idea about their structure, their function? Anybody wants to give me an idea? That will there be any relation in terms of the structure and function between these three proteins which gets generated through alternative splicing? So basically,
These proteins will be different, I think, in functionality.
So, no, they will not be completely different, because you see they have common regions. For example, these two protein have common domains, like 1, the region 1 will be common, region 6 will be common, right? So So 1 and 6 and 5, 1, 5, 6 is common between these two proteins. Similarly, 1, 5, 6 and 3 is common between these two proteins, right? That means these proteins will be to some extent similar in terms of their structure as well as function. However, they will not be completely the same. Okay, so say for example, there is a particular class of kinases called protein kinase C, and there are 11 different isoform of protein kinase C, and their role is almost the same, that is the phosphorylating different proteins. Okay, but then these different isoforms could be expressed in different tissues in a tissue specific manner. Okay, and they will have a little bit of differences in terms of their substrate specificity. So all these are enzymes, all these are phosphorylating proteins. Okay, their substrate specificity is almost the same, but they gets expressed in different tissues so that they can perform a little bit of different function. So these kind of proteins are known as, which are highly correlated, which are highly similar to each other in terms of the structure as well as function, but not exactly the same. These kind of proteins are known as isoforms. Okay, so that's why in case of the higher eukaryotes, you have higher variation of a single enzyme, which will be utilized in different regions, different portions of the body, different organelles of the body, maybe at different times of your life cycle and so on. Okay, so see, this is a very classic example that why our genome size is so much big, because we have so much of introns embedded in our genes. Okay,
Sir,
because yes.
sir, so during splicing, some of the exons might also be left out in addition to the introns, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm showing here. Like the alternative splicing actually can lead to different kinds of proteins where along with the introns, some of the exons could be left out, so that you can generate different variants of the same protein which will be similar to each other and hence will be denoted as isoforms. Okay.
Sir, but the thing is that this thing can also be done if there is no uh, what to say, that I mean unused parts, introns. That if there is no introns, then also this thing can be done. So what is the use of the introns?
No. So how would you be able to do that?
I
How
mean,
would you be able to do that? So basically, so you see, you once you have the mRNA will be utilized by the translation machinery in order to synthesize the proteins. Now, if you want to generate highly similar proteins which are similar to each other, that means you need to have mRNAs which will be to some extent similar to each other. Now, what you can do is you can have different genes which will be having similarity, right? What you are saying is you can have one particular gene for mRNA1, one particular gene for mRNA2, one particular gene for mRNA3. But then in that case, you will be having repeat regions, right, within your genome, right?
sir, I didn't understand. Can you just explain a bit more?
Yeah, so say for example, you instead of having introns and exons, you want to achieve the same goal. That means you want to produce similar proteins which will be having similar regions, right? That means their genome, their genes will be similar in terms of their sequences, right?
Yes, sir.
But if you do not have this particular mechanism, how can you do that? You can have a mechanism like, so you will be having gene 1 for protein 1, then again you will be having gene 2 for protein 2, again you will be having gene 3 for protein 3. But then gene 1, maybe this particular region will be maybe exactly the same as this particular region because both are encoding for 1, right? So you'll be having multiple repeated sequences. So that will be even wastage of resources, right? Because the polymerase has to come in and has to read all those, and it has to synthesize 3 different mRNAs, right? But here, using the single gene region, the polymerase can produce a big transcript and its work will be done. And then the splicing machinery will come in and will produce different final mRNAs, mature mRNAs, using alternative splicing.
Sir, actually, I am asking something else.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, I am saying that if there is no, I mean, introns. Okay, just exons are there, like exon 1, then exon 2, then exon 3, 4, 5, 6, like that. And for the first one, it just removes the 3, and for the second one, it just removed the fourth and second and fourth. For the
But how you are going to remove that? In that case, the polymerase has to jump maybe from 1 to 3 and then 3 to 5, like that, right?
I mean, I mean that is the problem. I mean the breaking can be done only from the introns, not from any other place, sir, like that.
No. So it's like I'm not going to, that the problem is I'm not discussing the mechanism of splicing, right? But it is a very well defined mechanism by which you can actually join this particular part to this part. It's just like stitching these two parts while removing the internal part. So that's a very well defined mechanism. But if you don't do it in that way, in that case, say for example, you want to produce a protein which like the mRNA, which will be having exon 1 and 3. That means in that case, the polymerase has to read the exon 1, then has to skip the entire part, and then have to go over there to read the exon 3. That means it has to skip the exon 2. That means the polymerase has to jump from here to here. That could lead erroneous transcription process. Okay, so that's why instead of doing that, the polymerase work is to produce the primary transcript. But then the splicing machinery comes in, which can precisely exclude specific regions and join different regions. Okay, for example, if it wants to join 1 to 2, so you can do that. If it wants to exclude 1 to the 2 and rather join 1 to 3, it can join these two ends while excluding the entire intermediate regions. Okay, in that way. Okay, so all right, so we have talked about three different post-transcriptional modifications. One is the mRNA, one is the capping, then polyadenylation, and then the splicing. And again, these three post-transcriptional processing occurs only in case of the eukaryotes. So you see, in the case of the eukaryotes, the DNA replication happens within the nucleus. Subsequently, transcription happens within the nucleus, and after transcription, the transcripts gets capped and polyadenylated, okay, and the introns gets excised to produce the final mRNA, and then that mRNA gets exported into the cytoplasm, which then gets recognized by the ribosome in order to perform the protein synthesis. Okay, but then as I was saying, that it's not that all of the protein gets synthesized all the time. There should be regulation. And more complex the organism is, the more complex the regulation would be. Okay, and these biological regulations actually act as a circuit. Okay, which when remains off, the gene expression will be switched off. That means there will be no transcript formation, and then there will be no protein formation. But when there will be synthesis of but when the circuit will remain on, there will be gene expression. That means there will be transcript formation as well as protein formation, protein synthesis, which will be happening. Okay. Okay. So for example, this is a classic example of regulation of gene expression. Okay, so we have one particular protein which regulates the spinal cord formation. Now, in the spinal cord, we have vertebra, and different organisms have different numbers of vertebra. For example, in the case of the chicken, there are 7 vertebra. In the case of the rat spine, there are 13 vertebra. And in the case of the, if you look into the python, it's all vertebra all across. Okay, so it can be inferred that the HOX-C8, the protein, particular protein, which leads to the vertebra formation, remains switched on for a particular period of time during the development of the chickens, which lead to the formation of 7 vertebra. In the case of the rat, maybe it remains switched on for longer period of time. That's why there are higher number of vertebra. And in the case of the pythons, the particular circuit remains switched on throughout the course of the life so that it can keep on synthesizing the vertebra throughout the course of the life. So you see, just by switching on and off one particular protein, you lead to the development of different kinds of organisms which are completely different in terms of their shape, size, and everything, right? And that is why the regulation of the protein synthesis or the regulation of the transcription, actually, in order to control the protein synthesis, you have to control the transcription. Okay, so that's why the regulation of transcription is extremely important. So regulation of gene expression. So each cell contains all genetic materials for growth and development. Okay, now, but still you have so many different cells. Your skin cells are different from your neuronal cells, right? Your muscle cells, right? All these are different cells. And these different cells, although have the same genetic information, but they expresses, so some of the genes gets expressed in all of these cells all the time. So those are basically housekeeping genes, which are essential to keep the house running, just for the maintenance. But then there are other genes which gets expressed at certain time in certain cells and not in other cells. Okay, so they are switched on and off at need. Whenever it's needed, then only they will remain switched on. So that's why we have different kinds of cells which forms different kinds of organelles. And then again, if you think about our heart versus a heart of a bird, right? So, or a heart of a mice, it's different, right? Although we have the same genes which are essential for the development of the heart, but still we have so many different kinds of organelles, like the same organelle but different shape and size. So why is it so? Because there are certain genes which remain switched on and off, which maintains the overall development process. Okay, so that's why regulation of gene expression is extremely important. Okay, now here we are going to talk about one very simple regulation which happens in bacteria. Okay, because that's well studied and that's to some extent simple to understand. Okay, there are multiple different instances of regulation of gene expression in eukaryotes, but those are more complicated. We don't want to get into that complication right now. Okay, so let's see. So in case of the E. coli, as I was saying, that they just want to extract the nutrient from the media. They need to metabolize it in order to generate the ATP. Those ATPs could be utilized for their DNA replication process so that they can produce more DNAs and hence can divide to produce more number of bacterial cells, right? Now, usually the E. coli, one particular class of the bacteria, and the most other bacteria are capable of growth using any one of the several carbohydrates. For example, glucose, sucrose, galactose, arabinose, and lactose as an energy source. The same is true for us as well. Whenever we are eating something, we look for glucose. We need glucose so that which could be metabolized to produce ATP. That's a major source of our energy. Same for bacteria. But bacteria would like to have simpler source of energy because their metabolism is more simpler. So now if glucose is present in the environment, it will be preferentially metabolized by the E. coli cells. Okay. But if there is no glucose, then they can grow on other carbohydrates as well. Okay, for example, there is no glucose, but there is lactose. That means it is not getting sugar, but it is getting milk. And you know, if you leave the milk outside, it can go bad very easily. Why? Because bacteria starts growing on it, growing in it. And why bacteria starts growing on in the milk? Because lactose is a good source of energy for the bacteria. Now, usually, if you give them sugar, they would like to utilize sugar because glucose is the easy source of energy. But if they cannot find sugar but find milk, the lactose, then they are bound to utilize lactose as a source of energy. Okay, and in order to metabolize lactose, they need two specific enzymes: the beta galactosidase and the lactose permease. These two enzymes are needed to metabolize the lactose. So, in the usual case, they should not be synthesizing these enzymes. If there is a glucose in the environment, they should be utilizing glucose, and they don't need these enzymes, right? They will need these enzymes when there is no glucose in the environment. Rather, they have to live upon lactose. Then only they will need these two enzymes. So, how does the bacteria even regulate the expression of these two enzymes so that when they want to utilize lactose as their energy source, then only they will synthesize these two enzymes? So that's the regulation we are going to see, that in case of the bacteria, if they find glucose in the environment, they will only utilize glucose. They will never utilize lactose. But if they do not find glucose, that's when they want to use the lactose, and in those circumstances only they will be able to synthesize these enzymes like the beta galactosidase and the lactose permease. How do they regulate the synthesis of these enzymes in that case? So you see, this is the lactose, okay, and the beta galactosidase is the enzyme which can cleave off this particular bond between the lactose to generate galactose and glucose, and subsequently the glucose can undergo glycolysis in order to generate the ATP. So under normal condition, as you see, if the bacteria finds the glucose, it can be directly utilized for the glycolysis to generate the ATP. No point utilizing glucose. So it will not be utilizing glucose, it will not be synthesizing those enzymes which are needed for the lactose metabolism. But when there is no glucose, that's when it needs to metabolize the lactose. Okay, so it needs to switch on the expression of those two enzymes. So now if you look into the particular genes which expresses those enzymes, this is how they look like. So in the bacterial chromosome, the LAC-Z expresses the beta galactosidase and LAC-Y expresses the lactose permease. So as you can see, these two enzymes remain situated one after another, and they are under the single promoter. Okay, so that once the RNA polymerase, so beta galactosidase that breaks the glucose into galactose and glucose, the lactose permease is actually important for the import of the lactose into the bacterial cell. So that once you have the lactose in the environment, the lactose permease will import the lactose inside the cell, and then beta galactosidase actually breaks the lactose into glucose and galactose. And then during this process, there is some toxic material which generates. So that's why the thiolactoside transacetylase is needed for the cell detoxification. So let's not focus on the LAC-A, let's focus on these two enzymes only. Okay, so as you can see, these three enzymes which are needed for the lactose metabolism remain situated very closely to each other and also remain situated under the same promoter. so that whenever there is a RNA polymerase which recognizes this promoter, it can synthesizes the mRNA which will be having all of these genes within the same mRNA. Okay, so what happens is, as the RNA polymerase recognizes this promoter, it transcribes the entire gene, synthesizing a mRNA which will have 3 different genes within it. So the first gene will lead to the synthesis of the beta galactosidase, the second gene will lead to the synthesis of the lactose permease, and the third gene will be synthesizing the LAC-A, the thiogalactosidase transacetylase. Okay, so once the transcription is on, it will be synthesizing a polycistronic. This kind of mRNA is having multiple different genes within it is known as polycistronic mRNA. Okay, and this polycistronic mRNA can lead to the synthesis of all these 3 different proteins. Now these 3 proteins are needed for the lactose metabolism, right, for the utilization of the lactose, right. So if this promoter is on, all of the protein will be synthesized and it will be utilizing lactose as an energy source. That means all you need to do is you need to switch on and or off this particular promoter. If there is a glucose, you need to keep the promoter in the off mode so that there will be no transcription, no synthesis of polycistronic mRNA, and hence no synthesis of these proteins. If there is no glucose in the environment but there is lactose in the environment, that's when you need to switch on this particular promoter so that there will be transcription, synthesis of mRNA, and hence synthesis of the protein. Now, how can you switch on and off this particular promoter? Let's see. So, bacteria actually expresses one particular protein which forms which is known as LAC repressor, and LAC repressor act in a tetrameric form. So basically there are 4 molecules, 4 subunit of the LAC repressor which together forms a tetramer, and that can recognize a DNA sequence which is just downstream of the promoter. That DNA sequence is known as LAC operator. Okay, so what happens is, in the usual course, the bacterial cell always synthesizes LAC repressor, and LAC repressor binds the LAC operator, and because it binds very close, LAC operator is very close to the LAC promoter, it kind of sterically inhibit the LAC polymerase to bind to the promoter. So see, in the previous case, the LAC polymerase can easily bind to the promoter and can perform the transcription. But in this particular case, because the LAC repressor remain bound to the LAC operator site, which is pretty close to the operator, that's why it inhibits the LAC polymerase to bind to the promoter, and hence it inhibits the transcription process. So in the usual case, there is always LAC repressor which binds to the LAC operator, and hence it keeps the LAC promoter in the switched off mode. Okay, but when there is a little bit of lactose in the environment, then if a very little amount of lactose by some kind of leak can enter into the cell, and there is a very little amount of beta galactosidase enzyme which is remaining, very basal level of beta galactosidase enzyme which is remaining in the cell, it can actually perform this reaction. Okay, and during this reaction it can produce a particular molecule which is called allolactose as a side product. So you see, in a straightforward reaction, the beta galactosidase can produce galactose and glucose, but in another course of reaction, the same enzyme can produce allolactose, which will then produce galactose and glucose. So allolactose gets produced as a side product of lactose metabolism, and this allolactose actually, once it gets produced, it can bind to the LAC repressor, and once allolactose bind the LAC repressor, there is a conformational change, the change in the structure of the LAC repressor, as a result of which the lac repressor can no longer bind to the lac operator. And once the lac repressor gets released from the lac operator, then the RNA polymerase can bind to the lac promoter and hence can initiate the transcription process. Now, that will lead to the synthesis of more beta galactosidase and lactose permease that will incorporate more lactose inside the cell, and that will lead to formation of more and more allolactose. So as a result of that, once the circuit switches on, that will keep on synthesizing more and more beta galactosidase and lactose permease in a positive feedback loop. So it will be acting as a positive feedback loop, because the more it will be synthesizing, the more it will be metabolizing the lactose, more will be breaking the lactose, there will be more formation of allolactose, and that allolactose will keep on releasing the lac repressor from the lac operator. That means more number of RNA polymerase can sit onto the lac operator to initiate the transcription process. So the entire process will keep on happening in a positive feedback loop. But only catch is there has to be lactose in the environment. If there is no lactose, there will be no allolactose formation. There will be no release of the lac repressor. There will be no transcription initiation which will take place. So if you look into the complete summary, you will see that if there is a glucose and no lactose, it will not initiate the transcription. That means lac repressor remains bound to the operator and the operon remains switched off. By the way, I forgot to mention that these kind of genetic organization is known as lac operon, where it's basically cluster of genes which are related by function, regulated by a single promoter. So here LAC-Z, LAC-Y and LAC-A, all these three are related by their function. All of them are needed for metabolizing the lactose. And these genes are clustered together and situated under the control of a same promoter. So that once the promoter gets switched on, the entire all three genes will get transcribed. So such kind of arrangement in the genetic architecture is known as operon. Such regions, the cluster of genes, are known as operons. For this particular case, it is known as lac operon. Hello? Hello, am I
Yes, sir,
audible?
you're audible.
Okay. So these and this particular case, the operon is named after lactose. That is why lac operon. So if the lac operon remains switched on, it will be metabolizing the lactose. And when will it remain switched on? So this is the case, that when you have a glucose but no lactose, the lac operon remains switched off. If there is a glucose and lactose, still glucose is better to easy to use. Then also the lac operon remains switched off. Okay. If there is no glucose but lactose, only in that situation you need to switch on the lac operon. When there is no glucose and no lactose, then also the lac operon will remain switched off. Okay. So you see, if there is a glucose, there will be an lactose. So there will be right AND or gate, right? So if there is a glucose, that means 1 1, but the total is 0. In that case, the total outcome will be 0. So if there is a glucose and lactose, it will remain switched off. Only in this case, that when there is no glucose, that means 0 and 1, then only the lac operon will remain switched on. Okay, so in that way, the lac operon can control the expression of the gene depending upon the environmental condition, that whether there is no glucose and presence of lactose. Okay, and these are the suggested books for whatever we have discussed in terms of the transcription as well as replication. Okay, and with that, let me know if you have any question we should be able to discuss. Otherwise, we'll stop the class. Any questions?
Sir, in case of like